Hi. What we have on the workbench at the moment is a completely disassembled music and sound model DMC1 Master Station. And for those of you who may or may not know, a DMC1 is the same as a NuTone NM 200, so this video applies to both models. This particular DMC1 was sent in by a fellow named Kent. Kent lives in Utah. It was installed when the house was built in 2005, which is correct based on the code dating of things on the circuit boards. The reason I decided to make this video this morning is because this DMC1 has probably just about every conceivable problem that a system could possibly have. Well, I guess it could have been blown up even more, but it has a wide range of problems, which made the repair of it quite interesting and somewhat either challenging or sort of multi-layered. The report on the unit is Kent has had problems with it over the last couple of years. He says nothing seems to happen with the power, tone, source, auto, and preset buttons when they're pushed. Sometimes the volume and tune buttons work, not always. Nothing happens when you speak and listen buttons. So the intercom buttons don't work. And then in my conversation with him, we talked about the idea that the switches on the display board probably need to be replaced. It has no radio, no intercom. So we talked about how the AM/FM tuner may need to be rebuilt. Of course, it needs LEDs for the backlight on the display because they all need LEDs on the backlight, and we might as well do it while it's here. And it's all taken apart. Before I had him send it, I had him do a reset and send him a link to a video about the system-wide adjustments to make sure things were set up correctly, and then do some deliberate checking to make sure that the problems that were reported were accurate. When the set showed up, the very first thing I did, which is what I always do, is I set it up on the workbench and built a little mini system for it. I had the master station powered by a music and sound transformer. I had it connected to a door station over there. I had two inside remote stations wired up to it to check it out and see what did and didn't work. It did power up and the display did show the time. However, as Kent reported, the switches on the display board worked erratically, if at all, and it was virtually impossible to set the time. You could turn the power on, but then the tuning didn't work correctly. If you tried to raise and lower the volume, it would switch back to the tuning mode. The tone button, which accesses the menus, didn't work correctly. It would go into a menu, and then you would try to make an adjustment, and then it would go out of the menu to something else, and basically it was all jacked up. So that was a problem. If the controls don't work correctly, then you really can't check out the rest. Because if you can't tune stations, because it wouldn't tune correctly, then you can't really tell if the radio is working or not, and. I did, before I did anything else, I did plug a known good chime module into it. The chime module did ring, which was a good sign, although I noticed right off the bat that it seemed to ring at lower volume than average. But since the set had a wide variety of problems, I figured I would deal with that as we went along. The other thing I noticed on the checkout was the intercom controls on the master station and on the remote speakers I had connected to it didn't work correctly. It would go, you'd try to do inside talk and sound wouldn't transmit, and then you try to do listen, and sometimes it would go into listen and sometimes it wouldn't. And if you tried to do door talk, which is both buttons pressed at the same time, it would go into door talk, but then immediately go to door listen while you were still holding the buttons, and that was all messed up too. So I figured the very first thing to do would be to replace the switches on the display board because we need working controls. The easiest way to deal with a set like this is to disassemble it completely. Take all the boards out of the faceplate, which we'll put aside to protect, and just deal with the boards themselves. So I started with the display board. The terminal board, which is just connections for the remote speakers, it was fine because there's nothing on it. It's just a bunch of sockets and some pins on the back, so no big deal there. On the display board, I replaced the 10 tactile switches, and I also replaced the 2 LEDs that are the backlight for the display, so that worked correctly. And then sort of Frankensteined it all back together so I could do a checkout on it that goes there. This one plugs in the back. The tuner gets hooked back up to it. And I have insulating cards that we put between the boards so things don't short out. And I was able to set it up on the workbench and test it out and see what we had. At that point, it became obvious to me that the intercom switches here on the audio board, this is the talk and listen switch, these needed to be replaced because the other ones were faulty and gave intermittent operation. So the two original ones were removed and these were put in their place. These are probably better quality and are a good fit for the original ones. So that was done. I also cleaned the control switches. These are the room control switches. I cleaned these. These have a tendency to become very hard to move, and a little bit of cleaner and work it back and forth, and that freed that up, and then it worked better. At that point, I put it all back together, tested it, hooked an antenna to it, and indeed, the controls then did work correctly. So I was able to power it on, set the time, set the timer for the auto on-off functions. I was able to tune radio stations and preset them into the memory locations. I was able to scroll through the menus and make system-wide adjustments and raise and lower the volume. That all worked good. And the backlights were nice and bright, so it was easy to read the display. What I found during the second checkout was the radio did play, but it had virtually no volume at all. You actually would have to take your ear and put it up against the grill where the speaker is and listen really carefully, and way off in the distance you could faintly hear the radio station play. In my thinking, because it's common, that was a failed tuner. So the tuner repair was the next thing to do. The tuner module was disassembled. You can see that because those little red dots and little red hash marks all over it with a felt pen marker, because when you take this apart, you have to get the lids back on in the right directions and so on. And that's just the way I like to mark it up. It makes it easier for me. The tuner was disassembled. I did some quick checks on it, did sort of the typical rebuild of the AM/FM tuner, put it all back together, plugged it back into the set, and then what we had was enough volume out of the set that if you were just sitting in front of it, you could hear it sort of, but not nearly the volume that it should have had. So that indicated to me that we had yet another problem. So now it was time to take a look at the power supply and amplifier board, which is what this is, or perhaps it's a module is a better name for it. So I did some quick checks on this. I didn't find anything specifically wrong that typically goes wrong with these, because these do have a tendency to go poof and die sometimes. It seemed, based on what I saw and measured, that this board needed to be rebuilt. So I went through, I replaced some voltage regulators. That's just belt and suspenders kind of work. You should always do that when you do one of these, in my opinion. And then replaced a bunch of other components that may have somewhat aged out. You know, the system is 20 years old. It's not that old, but these sets have certain specific problems because of how they're designed. One of the big problems with the DMC and NM series is that it's a relatively small master station. It's about the same width as most intercoms, but it's about half the height. It fits into a wall housing that's approximately half the size of a more traditional intercom, and the space within the wall housing is filled up with all of this. This has a tendency, the power module has a tendency to run hot, and there is a big aluminum heatsink like this that sits here like this, which of course was a genius place to mount the AM/FM tuner to. So the AM/FM tuner is encased in a shielded metal box, which is attached to a metal bracket that's bolted to the big aluminum heatsink, that's bolted to the small heatsink here that has the output transistors up for the amplifier on it. So this all bolts like this. And then, along with all the other boards, it's all squeezed into a wall housing that's half the size of a regular wall housing, and it has virtually no ventilation at all because there's no openings. It's enclosed. Oh, and let's not forget that in that wall housing is also the big low voltage transformer, which generates heat also. So basically what you have is you have an intercom that's installed in the wall inside of an oven. That's the reason why tuners fail. So back to this. So since everything runs hot all the time, components on here will fail earlier than average because they're in a hot environment and they never cool off. After the power module was rebuilt, everything was reassembled yet again. I can't tell you how many times I put this thing back together to try to figure out where we were with it. We had improved volume. So when we began on initial testing, on a 1 to 10 scale, the volume out of the set was probably a 0.5. Virtually couldn't hear it unless you put your ear up against the speaker. Once we got the tuner rebuilt, we probably jumped up to a 2.5 or 3 on the 1 to 10 scale. When we rebuilt the power module, our volume increased from that 2.5 to 3 to probably a 5 to 6, probably closer to 5. Let's say 5.5 is fair. It was better, but it still wasn't good enough. It wasn't the amount of volume that you would expect out of a DMC1. And the low volume was now across the board. It was AM, it was FM, it was the 2 auxiliary audio inputs, which is auxiliary and CD. It was also the door chime that had low volume, and it was also the intercom that had low volume, both for inside talk and listen and door talk and listen. Everything was functioning correctly, but we had lesser volume than we would normally expect for a DMC1. At that point, that left the audio board. The audio board is probably the most complex board in the set to work on because of how it's made. It uses almost all surface mounted parts. They're all miniature sized parts, and they use a lot of discrete integrated circuits, some of which are in packages that aren't commonly available, so they're a little hard to find. So this board has been updated many times in the DMC lifespan. The early ones like this use a dedicated chip here, which has to do with audio, input, output, volume, so on and so on. Later ones, this was replaced with a microprocessor, or actually it's a microcontroller. Those boards are unrepairable if they have a problem, and the microcontroller is the source of the problem. So the problem with this board was isolated to this section because this is the audio input control section of this entire board. And what I found there were 2 small transistors, and when I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about half the size of a grain over ice. Very interesting to work on. That's why we have a microscope, because otherwise you can't see it well enough to actually remove the original ones and put in new ones. So a couple transistors were replaced. Fortunately, this control IC was okay, because this is a difficult package to remove, and also it's an expensive part compared to other things. This board was worked on, and then it was all reassembled yet again, and that was yesterday afternoon towards the end of the day, and I hooked it all back up and powered it up and turned it on, and for the very first time, it not only all worked correctly, and it had the amount of volume that you would expect out of a DMC1. This is a good example of all the different kinds of things that can go wrong with a single intercom master station that you have to approach in the right way and in the right steps to try to deduce where the problems are and work through the problems one at a time. There were a lot of misleading problems with it that you could have spent a lot of time on without solving the more fundamental problems, and that's just wasted time. So my job now is, before the end of this video, I'm going to pause. I'm going to put this thing all back together, because I'm pretty sure that everybody wants to see it actually play. And also, I don't like to tell people that something's all fixed unless I can actually show that it's all fixed, because that's when fate wants to slap you in the back of the head. Oh no, it's all better now, and then you put it all back together, and then there's another problem. And sets like this, sometimes you do spend a fair amount of time chasing from one problem to the next. So I'm going to pause, I'm going to put it all back together, set it all back up with our little mini system, and show you, hopefully, cross your fingers, that it actually does work. Can't Music and Sound DMC1 has been reassembled. And yes, I did do some pre-testing on it, and yes, it does work correctly. So you can see here, time has been set, 12:33 a.m. This is January 3rd, Friday morning. Actually, I guess it's afternoon now. So we can set the time button works. We can raise and lower. We're not going to change it all because really what's the point? But you can scroll through the menus. We can turn the power on. Comes on in auxiliary. I do have an auxiliary source connected to the CD input. So if we switch here,
okay, freedoms or whatever you want, but it will
turn the music down. So that's a podcast. It's on the CD input. And if we turn this off, moving the cable is difficult because there's a tight squeeze back here. Again, because everything is small. There we go. That should work. The power on, source, auxiliary.
But if you can,
we can raise the volume.
Probably the easiest way to do it is use Mylio.
We have plenty of volume,
including your Google Takeout.
Turn that down. We can switch to AM. That's our AM test signal that I use here in the shop along with other radio stations. AM reception in this area sometimes is less than great. So this is a small AM transmitter that I have here in the shop, and it's useful for all types of AM tuning adjustments or tuning alignments. And that's the signal. We can switch to FM. We have a variety of stations. We can't leave them on too long, copyright thing and all like that. We can use the tone button, which is really the menu button, and scroll through the menus. Master volume, down and up to 29 is maximum. Then we have loudness on and off. We have bass and treble, that's treble. We'll set it to 9. Bass, we'll set that to, oops. That to 9 also. Oops, there we go. And bass should be 9. Intercom volume 19. We'll do that in a second. And music volume, that's the radio or audio volume for the entire system. We can raise it way up.
Use Mylio. But what I did is I used a program called
plenty of volume.
JHEAD.
Turn it down.
I think some of this is also good.
Turn that off. Now, intercom controls work. All of the switches here have been cleaned. They're all set to radio intercom positions. So we have inside talk. And oh, I have 2 speakers connected to it. I have one remote speaker here, another remote speaker over there, and a door station at the end of the workbench as always. So talk works, listen, door talk. We got howling. Door listen. That works. Cancel that. We'll use this remote station at the other end of the workbench. I'll tell you why in a second. So we have talk. We have listen. We have door talk. And door listen. Works fully. We can use the on-off scan buttons. We can turn the music on and turn it up.
Your site, Phil. He says
we can lower the volume until it turns off. And we can use the scan feature if we turn it on. There's AM. It'll scan through the presets. I don't have them all programmed. There's your AM. Turn the volume up. And turn the volume down. It's always safe playing classical music on the radio because classical music is not copyrighted mostly, not always, sometimes. One of the things that's interesting, the reason that we're using this remote speaker, this is the one with the long cable, as opposed to this one that has the short cable, is because the intercom switches under here on this circuit board. This is my shop test speaker. This was brand new when I started using it, which was probably only, could have been 3 or 4 years ago, not that long ago, and not used them like a million times. These switches in here need to be replaced. And I think one of the ugly truths about music and sound systems, oh, see, this one says NuTone, but it's the same as a music and sound. One of the ugly truths about music and sound systems are they have bad switches. whether it's the tactile switches here, or the intercom switches, or the intercom switches on this, or switches on an MC602, or an MC302, or an N350, or an N353. It doesn't matter. Music and sound, I think they tried really hard to choose good quality switches, but it seems like they all go bad at some point or another, which I think is very unusual and very unfortunate because it creates all kinds of problems. Anyway, Kent's intercom has now been repaired. It's been fully tested. You've seen it. You're the witness. You can swear to it. I hope you found this interesting, and maybe for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube because that helps us just a little bit. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications. And every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.